Okay, everyone, I think it's time to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Anharid Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Very happy to be serving as your host today for this webinar, Coordination and Collaboration with the Global Protection Cluster, the next 5 years. This is organized by PHAP in partnership with the Global Protection Cluster, the GPC. And on that note, I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator today, Paul White, who is connecting from Bangkok. Hello, Paul.
Good evening, and greetings colleagues from Bangkok. I'm a small part of the Asia Pacific Regional NGO Partnerships Week here. So welcome to everyone.
So with that, we will turn to the substance of today's events. And before introducing our panelists, I'd like to briefly outline what we're hoping to cover in this webinar. We'll first talk about coordination and humanitarian response in general and the role of trust for coordination. We'll then be discussing what are the main challenges and weaknesses with current protection coordination mechanisms and structures. And then with these challenges in mind, we'll be looking at ways in which protection coordination can be improved, and in particular, the role of the GPC for protection coordination as we move forward. I'm really pleased to say we had a lot of registrations for this event, so we have a lot of you participating in the Adobe Connect platform here. We also have a lot of people on the live stream. We had more than 600 registrations, and more than 200 people completed the event survey, which has been incredibly helpful both for the preparation of the event we're embarking on now, also very helpful to feed into the report of this event and ultimately into the strategic review currently being undertaken by the GPC. So thank you so much to all of you who took the time to complete that survey. Those of you who haven't will have one more chance. I'll mention that at the end of the event today. So now I'd like to turn again to Paul and ask, Paul, what do you hope to get out of this webinar today? Over to you.
Thanks again. So these are concepts of collaboration, coordination, cooperation, connection, linkages. The nexus is the new one. Working together, interagency coordination is sometimes also collaboration, integration. Some of these things are done formally and informally. So all these concepts mean different things to different people, and they occur at the practitioner level, the operational level, the strategic level. And at some of these concepts and issues that many of you have raised with me in the months that we've been working on this strategic framework for the GPC. So I hope today we can unpack some of these issues and that they'll feed in then to our strategic framework and also the work plans of the GPC over the next 5 years. So I'm very much looking forward to the consultations as we draw an end and we come to an end of our consulting on this strategic framework. So many thanks to you all for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Paul. And to echo that, I would really like to encourage everyone on the line today to engage actively in the discussion in the chat and to submit questions, comments, observations throughout the event. We'll be asking our panelists if they're willing to answer any questions that we don't have time to discuss live during the event. We'll ask them to address those in writing after the event as well. So we hope to keep the discussion going even after our short hour and a half is over today, and that will feed both into the email follow-up that you'll receive as well as into the report of the events. So now I'd like to introduce our guest panelists. Today we're joined by 6 speakers, all bringing their perspectives from different experiences onto these questions related to protection coordination. So on the line we have Panos Mumtsis, a regional humanitarian coordinator for the Syria crisis. He's connecting today from Amman. Welcome, Panos. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you. Thank you very much.
We also have on the line Rebecca Scuvby, protection specialist, connecting today from Rome. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and hello to everyone.
Also on the line, and in fact also on the line, and in fact connecting today from our office in Geneva. Great to have with us Charles Deutscher, who's policy advisor with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks very much, Anhad, and really looking forward to hearing everyone's reflections.
And we have on the line connecting from Erbil, Iraq, Claudia Nicoletti, who is Protection Cluster Coordinator in Erbil. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
And then connecting from Copenhagen today, we have Catherine Starup, head of the Protection Unit with the Danish Refugee Council. Welcome to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much.
We'll also be hearing from Daniel Aldrich. Daniel Aldrich is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security and Resilience Studies Program at Northeastern University in the United States. As he's currently traveling, he was not able to join the event live, but he very kindly pre-recorded a few brief points that we will be feeding into the discussion. So, good. To help set the stage for these discussions, I would like to first turn once again to my co-facilitator, Paul, to ask what is the current coordination role of the protection cluster? Over to you, Paul.
Thanks again. Well, at global level, the GPC coordinates the development of policy, standards, and operational tools relating to protection and humanitarian action, and also the delivery of practical guidance on how to establish and manage protection coordination mechanisms. And then at country level, our protection cluster supports the delivery of specific protection activities, as well as assessments and analysis, cluster strategy. Mainstreaming of protection is also a big part of our protection cluster's work, and also coordinating and contributing to advocacy. But at the same time, the clusters need to contribute to the decision-making of the humanitarian coordinator and the humanitarian country team. So there are big jobs involved there, and Claudia will tell us a bit later about the practicalities of some of the operational side of it from Iraq.
Great, thank you. So sticking with you, Paul, you've already carried out face-to-face consultations, quite a lot of them over the last months. How has the issue of coordination come up during those consultations?
Well, it's come up in many ways and a very, with a broad range of issues and views. But we chose collaboration and coordination because they've come up so regularly over the last 9 months, and many people wanted to discuss them a bit more. We included Daniel Aldrich too because he's done some great research on coordination. And I think his research can help us understand some of the problems we face and that the GPC may be able to help resolve over the next 5 years. I mean, one sentence in his research paper that struck me as a really sad situation was that it says that failures in coordination and communication during disaster response have been so common that they're expected. And I think this applies to us in protection. Certainly in several places I've worked in the last few years, there have been too many arguments, too much friction around our protection structures as the disaster strikes. So I think at the start of a crisis and during a disaster is not the time to be responding to these differences. So I'm hoping that our webinar today will identify how the lack of definition and the clarity around protection coordination can be fixed. I'm hoping some of our panelists can identify what we might do to fix some of our problems, and also identify where academic research that can be quite independent of agencies or particular approaches might help us as practitioners make better decisions. So this lack of coordination creates confusion, and we're hoping that some of that confusion can be allayed by the discussions with our panelists today.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. I'm just noticing the polls stating that although I know there have been a lot of consultations, it looks like almost all of the participants on today's webinar have not yet been part of those consultations. So again, a really good opportunity for all of you on the line to feed in to this discussion. So, Paul, we organized a webinar together with the GPC about a month back, looking at how nexus reforms affect protection. How would you say that discussion relates forward to today's event?
Well, I think nexus and coordination are very much related. We actually had a recommendation from that earlier webinar to create coordination platforms where humanitarian, development and peace policymakers and practitioners come together to plan and collaborate, because currently many people see that these are parallel and segregated platforms. So do we need more coordination or less? So it'd be great if panelists can comment on this as well, how they might see the development of coordination in the nexus.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to turn to our panel now, first to Claudia, and to kick off this part of the discussion, we're going to take a look at some of the results from the survey that so many of you participated in just over the past week in advance of this webinar. When we asked participants about the importance of different entities for protection coordination, the GPC and national protection clusters were more or less tied, as you can see, with OCHA. When we asked then in a separate question about which actors should have a leading role, the GPC came out strongly in the lead. And I would like to ask you first, Claudia, as the Protection Cluster Coordinator in Iraq, in practice, what does that look like? What is the coordinating role of the Protection Cluster in the context where you're working?
Thank you very much for this question. So I try to be as brief as possible and stick to the point. Just perhaps to give an idea of what's the level of the protection coordination mechanism in Iraq. It's a very large operation, as I'm sure you all know, and the coordination mechanism can be somewhat complex and challenging to manage. So we have 4 subclusters. We have child protection, GBV, mine action, HRP, and their respective governor-level protection working group. We have 10 governor-level protection working group under what we define as general protection component. We coordinate almost 100 partners, strategic advisory group, legal partners meetings, ad hoc technical working groups, etc., etc. So such a large coordination structure, as you can imagine, there is always a coordination gaps, which is they are very much due to staff turnover, due to holidays, capacity issue, and this can certainly have an impact on the timeliness and effectiveness of the response. And if I may, maybe a bit later, I have a couple of suggestions that could be useful now to tackle some of those challenges, also based on the discussion with other colleagues and panelists. On top of this, of course, the protection cluster in Iraq has been serving as an advisory role on protection issues to the humanitarian country team and its member, even though it's quite peculiar because the Iraq context, the cluster, so ICCG or single cluster, do not attend HCT meetings, but only on ad hoc basis when critical or specific issues are presented and discussed. We do contribute constantly in terms of raising critical protection incidents and issues through advocacy notes or guidance on specific protection and solutions, let's say for people with perceived affiliation to extremist groups, etc., etc. However, it's quite a peculiar role, the one that we have vis-a-vis the HCT and the members. Another point that I would like to add, vis-a-vis also the discussion of the guidance coming from the GPC in coordinating protection, is the fact that coordination in some operation, as well as in Iraq, is immersed in every process. I mean, if we look at the HNO HRP process, this year we do have new formats, new templates, and it's been quite challenging, I think, for everyone to get acquainted with that. And sometimes the decision is, they do not come, let's say, from the bottom, but they are somehow discussed at the global level, and then there are perhaps not enough consultation with clusters in the different countries. So in some of those processes, the cluster coordinators are required to engage in discussion at the national level in country, in discussion that should have been agreed or streamlined at the global level first, and then adapted to the national level. And these might have also implication when it comes to being perceived as implementing different elements of the same process in different countries, and eventually that could lead to confusion by external stakeholders. So there are impacts, there are consequences that even if we do rely quite heavily on the guidance coming from the GPC as the main coordination body when it comes to protection, might have some repercussion in country like Iraq, at least in my experience in the past 2 years. Over.
Great, thanks so much, Claudia. We have a follow-up question for you that's just come in from Philomena, who's working in Sierra Leone with the World Health Organization. Philomena says, I'd like to hear about how the different subclusters within the protection cluster can best coordinate, particularly GBV. You mentioned the different subclusters in your context. I wonder if you could help with some reflections on that question. Back to you, Claudia.
Indeed, it's a very interesting question, and some of the challenges actually arise from this overall structure of the cluster. It's, of course, each subcluster has its own coordinators and co-coordinators and partners. In terms of one of the main challenges that we've been experiencing here is the fact that the issue of accountability. Because we all sit and we are all on an equal footing, and there is not a level of accountability vis-a-vis subcluster and what we define as the general protection or the NPC coordinators. And when, let's say, to put it in a simple way, when things go well, everyone is happy. When things go bad, it's a bit challenging to let other stakeholders understand that this level of accountability is not there. Therefore, we work together and we cooperate together, but without pointing finger or being accountable for whatever might not be going towards the right direction. So we do have to overcome those challenges. Of course, we do have coordinators meeting once a month. We do have the strategic advisory group meeting where all the subcluster coordinators sit, and we try to work together or at least consult as much as possible whenever we have to produce public documents or HNO or HRP documents. Of course, there is the fact that, and that goes perhaps to another discussion, there is this distinction in terms of general protection, child protection, GBV, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we are all part of the national protection cluster. So the umbrella is one, and it's the national protection cluster, although there are those specificities and also obstacles, challenges, and opportunities that come when we have different subsector or subcluster elements to take into consideration.
Great, thanks so much for that. So we'll be coming back to you with more Q&A, but for now we're going to move to the recording that was submitted by Daniel. So Daniel Aldrich has been doing extensive research on coordination in emergencies, including on some of the operations where many of our participants in the event today have been active in their work. So the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar 2008, the Chile tsunami 2010, Haiti earthquake, Pakistan floods. We've been, and he's still active and has been working on some research in Somalia as well. To help launch the discussion on protection coordination, we asked him to share some of the findings from his research, looking at what are some of the tensions and challenges in coordination in humanitarian emergencies, and what makes for successful coordination in such settings. So first we're going to hear particularly about some of the tensions and challenges that arose from this very innovative research. So cue recording.
This is Daniel Aldrich. Thanks so much for including me, Marcus, Paul, and colleagues in your conference. I apologize I can't be there in person to be a part of it. I want to try to answer two questions that Marcus and Paul raised in earlier email back and forth. One was about what are some of the findings from this newest paper that we just put out on the tensions and challenges in coordination during humanitarian emergencies and crisis. So of course, always the usual caveat, this is based on a relatively medium data set of around 18 disasters around the world. And of course, it's based on my own interpretation. But having said that, I think there were some patterns that showed up in these 18 disasters, which drew from developing and developed countries, recent and more historical disasters, and also disasters of different types, both natural hazards and man-made ones. What I found was that really three types of factors led to more friction, that is to say, top-down and bottom-up approaches not being coordinated. Those were lower levels of development. If the shock, if the crisis took place in a country, like Bangladesh, for example, like Mozambique, as opposed to, let's say, England or Japan, it was more likely we'd have friction. That's one thing. The next was somewhat surprising. It was that lower economic costs from the crisis also tended to lead to more friction, meaning if it wasn't a massive disaster, it seemed more challenging to coordinate across areas. And the third finding was actually pretty obvious, I think, which is that when you had before the disaster relatively challenges with logistical infrastructure and planning, those would also end up with mismatches and chaos during the response itself. So, I mean, that tells us a few different things, I think, up front. One is that we should be more concerned, I think, about smaller scale shocks than larger ones. In larger ones, we're more likely to have a coordinated response precisely because it may be on the front burner of both local decision makers and also national or international ones. Unlike, let's say, smaller level disasters, areas that are more regional or micro-local in their impact, it may be in such cases we're going to have a harder time coordinating the various responses across levels of response. That's one idea. The next is we ought to be very more careful, perhaps, in responding to disasters abroad, especially in developing nations. And again, this seems to be pretty consistent across our data set. Different types of shocks were simply not handled as well in foreign countries that were still developing. Of course, all kinds of reasons for that. Perhaps because less developed countries simply have maybe less developed rule of law, they have fewer precedents in place, there's less money for training and bureaucracies and response tools, technologies are not as high, and so forth and so on. But again, that's another thing to think about as well. And again, more broadly, communities that we already know that had shocks and disasters beforehand that were poorly responded to, that is to say, where there's infrastructure problems, roads, for example, railroads and so forth, those areas that are less developed to begin with, those are more likely areas that we'll see, whether it's going to be, for example, in Chile or elsewhere, where we're going to have a more challenging disaster response.
Okay, so we're going to go back to Daniel's recording for that second question in a little while. But now we'd like to move on to some of our other panelists. First, though, one look again at the results from the pre-event survey. We asked participants as well whether they thought that protection coordination was suffering due to a lack of trust. And a solid majority of respondents, nearly 60%, agreed or strongly agreed with that notion. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Charles, who's policy advisor with the ICRC, and to ask Charles, so the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent is coming up very soon in December. I know a lot of last-minute preparations are underway now, and trust is one of the central topics for the conference this year. Is there a lack of trust in the humanitarian sector? And how does this affect coordination, broadly speaking, with the understanding that the ICRC is not involved in the cluster directly, but broadly speaking, do you see that link between a lack of trust and negative impact on coordination more broadly? Over to you.
And thanks very much. It is indeed on the agenda of the conference, and you know, trust, as they say, comes on foot and leaves on horseback. And you know, protection is at the heart of what we do at the GPC and at the ICRC, and trust in turn is at the heart of protection. But it's kind of this trust is this sort of nebulous concept that most people probably don't examine in detail as it relates concretely to protection work. but everyone kind of knows it when they feel it, especially in the field, either when they are trusted or when they need to trust someone else. Think of a detention visit or a family reunification, for example. And clearly, as the results from your respondents suggest, there are instances where trust is sorely lacking in the humanitarian sector. Think of Ebola and the kind of wider fallout from the sexual misconduct cases of last year. But equally, there are cases where trust is present in humanitarian action and where it works swimmingly. An example from Friday in the ICSE in Helmand, where we were involved in the exchange of prisoners between the Afghan authorities and the Taliban. And so I guess in this sense, trust speaks to the best, but also to the worst of what we do as humanitarian actors and as protection practitioners. And that's really why trust is on the agenda of the conference, because of the battering that the tech sector's taken in the public eye in recent years, but also because of states' sort of constant pressure on the humanitarian space in which we work and the regime set up by IHL. And so, how does this all relate to coordination? Well, I can't comment on technical aspects like Claudia can, but let me perhaps offer just two broader reflections on trust, which may nourish your more technical ones. The first is the link between trust and field security, and I guess even the broader principle of do no harm. For the ICSC, field security is based on the notion of acceptance by all stakeholders, and you can't be accepted without some degree of trust. And so how do we go about building trust better with all stakeholders, communities, authorities, arms carriers, and colleagues? And this is kind of a question that we're grappling with on a sort of acceptance, tolerance, rejection spectrum, and I would commend to you a study called The Roots of Restraint, which gives some good insights on building trust with arms carriers. But I think it's an important consideration for coordination, since it's often in situations where security is the tightest that sometimes sensitive protection work is the most difficult to do. Think of the kind of access issues in Rakhine, Myanmar, and even the situation of people allegedly affiliated with IS in Claudia's context in Iraq. And I think an aspect related to that for protection work is the relationship of trust with the communities in which and with which we work. Particularly if we're expatriate staff, I think we often work on the basis that communities should approach us with a presumption of trust. Yet perhaps in reverse, we don't reciprocate and sometimes view communities with suspicion or even mistrust. Now, there may of course be good reasons for this, but from my experience, I think it's got at least as much to do with fear of the unknown, even ignorance, than anything else. And again, considering the ICSE's kind of recent security reflections on how to overcome this, better briefings, handovers, and analysis on critical aspects of culture, religion, politics, history, economy, etc. Longer missions rather than fly in, fly out, except for really technical work and more capacity building of local staff towards management positions and sustainability. And if you're interested in that kind of an angle, Marc Dubois, literally just about an hour ago, published a blog with a similar angle called The Other Side of Trust. Secondly, and finally, just quickly, I think in addition to our external relationships, we could also reflect on trust in our internal relationships within our own organizations and within the GPC, because I guess these two can impact the day-to-day of coordination. I'm sure the GPC is much better, but I think it's a telling fact that, or finding that came out of the ICSE's 2014 staff survey, and that was that the biggest cause of stress was not bombs and bullets, but it was management. And so I think improvements no doubt have been made since then, but we'd do well, I think, to continue to remind ourselves to approach colleagues with the same good faith with which we would have them approach us. And I think indeed a part of the trust discussions at the conference may turn to trust within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. But let me stop there and hand it back to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Charles. and very interesting points, I think, food for thought and to feed into the rest of the discussion. So thank you for that. I'd like to turn now to Panos. So Panos, as the regional coordinator for the Syria crisis, and before that, the director of the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Team, STITE, you've been very well placed to see how coordination for protection has functioned in practice, both in the complex Syria response and elsewhere. As we're starting this event with looking at the challenges and the weaknesses of coordination in practice, in your experience, what have humanitarians particularly been struggling with in these contexts in terms of protection coordination? Over to you, Panos.
Thank you. Thanks, Ankard, and really very good question. When I look at the protection clusters work and in operation, basically it's 3 levels that need to happen to also make sure that the protection has really been taken on board. One is obviously the protection clusters, sectors, strategy, analysis, vulnerability work, and that's the foundation really of the work itself. The second one is obviously the mainstreaming, to make sure that every other sector has taken into consideration the vulnerabilities, and that the protection analysis guides a lot of the practical operation response, whether it is the camp coordination, the site planner, the health or education, and so on. And the part that brings me in a lot, both in my current capacity and in my last job as director of the state, is really the leadership of protection. To see how the protection clusters work goes hand in hand with a very important role to also be played by the leadership in country, the humanitarian coordinator, the humanitarian country team. And that's where these 3 levels really need to flow. The Global Protection Cluster a few years back, and I think this is more learning from the Sri Lanka crisis, we developed the centrality of protection, the role of leadership protection, and the fact that protection, it has to be dealt both at the practical operational working level, but also at the top level, because it is the senior leadership that meets with the ministers, prime ministers, ambassadors, others at the top level, and one needs to have both the advocacy, including behind closed doors, not always just public, but the leadership engagement, and then the operational side. So where I think we're not quite there yet is, one is to ensure that this dialogue takes place quite effortlessly, and I was happy to hear Claudia, and I think Iraq is a very good example from years back where that critical protection node is being developed by the protection sector to be able to come to the humanitarian coordinator and say, this month, for example, protection of civilians in northwest Syria and Idlib, where bombing is taking place, is an issue. We want you to pick it up and raise it at multiple levels, but also to give back that feedback to the protection sector and back and forth. So 2 issues. One is the interflow to activate the leadership, to mobilize the leadership on advocacy, on mobilization is not always working. And I did 22 missions with states, and I hate to say in all of the countries we've been, it was an issue. And the second one is really on the protection sector itself to come up and say, here is the most critical issue at this point. I remember coming here to Syria, and I was so much looking forward, and I asked the protection sector, I said, can I see, what would you like me to bring forward from the leadership point of view? And I got a list of 13 protection priorities. And I said, you know what? I mean, all of them are very valid, all of them are quite acute, but really, what is the most critical protection issue that you would like me to take at this point, 1 or 2 or 3? And I think that took quite a while. We have it now. I'm very proud of the response from the team we have in the place. In a very complex situation, again, state, non-state actors, in government, non-government control areas, very complicated operation. But to be able, as a protection sector, to come up as a cluster and give a reply not from a mandate point of view, not saying, oh, children, or GBV, or, really to look more from a people point of view, from an affected people point of view, and to come up and say, that's the issue. And for me, the rate of success is really, how can we make practically make a difference in people's lives. To give an example, last year we picked up the issue of civil documentation and of course the protection of civilians and the conduct of hostilities. These were the two issues I worked all year round, and it was finding ways to make sure that every Syrian, no matter where they were, we were able to find solutions, and the advocacy took place at the leadership level while the protection sector did its work to support and implement it and to make it happen, including the role of leadership on resource mobilization. Money should not be the reason of why we're not doing some of these activities. So adding my voice together with my other colleagues on the resources was also crucial with donors and capitals. Ankhar, over to you.
Great, thanks, Panos. I have a question that's come in from Dina in Switzerland, and we could save this for later, but actually I think it fits well following your reflections now. Dina is asking, how does the GPC connect with or fit in with the broader humanitarian architecture? And what is its added value? Big question, but if you have any reflections, that would be much appreciated. Back over to you, Panos.
Thank you, and thanks to Dina for the question. My answer is very simple. We as humanitarian actors, whether it's United Nations or NGOs, we are not a courier delivery of assistance company. We're not DHL. We are really driven by human rights. So protection has to be the central thinking of everybody, all of us, in terms of the implementation, the programming, the analysis, the need assessment. If we don't have protection in our work, we know it doesn't work. I remember going to the Philippines at the highlight of the Typhoon Haiyan to do a review with state, and we were told there, we took out, for example, the gender-based questions because gender is not an issue in a natural disaster, and it only took an hour's focus group with a group of affected women to find out what had really happened. So protection has to be central, both in the architecture, but more importantly, on the programmatic response in all aspects of what we do, whether we design a camp, we'll look at how to take people freedom of movement from A to B, any movement returns that has to be protection guided. I can go on and on for every sector and aspect of the response. Without protection, I would say we lose the credibility, we lose the value, we lose the raison d'etre of why we do the job we all do when we get up in the morning. Over to you, Ankhar.
Great, thanks again, Panos. I'll turn now to Catherine Starup. As head of the protection unit of the Danish Refugee Council, you have been engaged in protection cluster coordination efforts in humanitarian response to conflict situations in many parts of the world. I wonder, from your perspective, from an NGO that often works very closely with the protection cluster, what are the challenges and weaknesses in terms of coordination that you would highlight from your experience? Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, I mean, not only at the global level in terms of engaging with the GPC, but also very regular contact with my country and regional protection coordinators, as well as the co-coordinators or co-leads, the NGO co-leads that we are, that role that we play in quite a number of operations these days. So I have sort of 5 challenges, weaknesses I want to pull out. Broad strokes, of course, but I have also received very valuable input specifically for this webinar from West Africa, North Africa, and East Africa. So the first one is around the very functioning of the field protection clusters. And yeah, there are quite, I mean, broad strokes in terms of low accountability that Claudia also mentioned, ensuring that buy-in and that commitment, it all ties together. So if the protection cluster is not functioning well, if there's a low commitment, you know, and low accountability, I mean, that all bites itself. And lack clarity at times in terms of roles and responsibilities and the very purpose, I mean, in terms of inefficiency of the protection cluster and what role it needs to play. So, I mean, unpacking that, there are elements around the dialogue, ensuring a good and clear dialogue and engagement in the protection cluster as such, but also the national protection cluster vis-a-vis the GPC and across protection clusters also. So when that is not functioning, then the GPC, the protection cluster as such is not functioning very well. There are challenges around the soft skills, extremely important soft skills of coordination, both with the coordinator and the co-lead, but also with the members as such. And yeah, there's a capacity gap as such in terms of that important soft skill of coordinating and being the convener. So that's the first one. The second one is around data analysis and strategy. So here again, we see weaknesses around lack of structured collaborative approaches to data management, the lack of data sharing and analysis sharing, harmonized tool, and capacity more generally around data management. That leads to the next challenge, which is to, once you have collected your data, to make sense of it, the whole analysis around it. And again, I mean, about lack of sharing of analysis and building capacity, building that needed consensus on what is the situation, what are the protection risks, what are the strategic priorities within protection. If that is not in place, then it suffers. Lastly is around strategy, of course, that you move from data to analysis to strategy. And here again, we see challenges and weaknesses around the lack of time, lack of resources to produce that analysis that is needed to produce your protection strategy. And what Panas also mentioned, I think, is that whole engagement of the field protection cluster vis-a-vis the HC, the HCT, and so on, and engaging in the humanitarian program cycle and feeding into HNOs and so forth. And again, here we see challenges around the lack of authority also that comes with the lack of time and the lack of capacity, surely, but also, again, in terms of the clarity and the role of the protection cluster in terms of protection strategy and what role it plays not only within the cluster but vis-a-vis the other, the rest of the coordination structure, so to speak. We have also seen what Claudia, I think, mentioned about one thing is the national protection cluster, but then what about the subclusters? And again, here we see a lack of time and challenges around having a coherent approach, having the one cluster approach, so to speak. Three more, and I'll be very quick, but one is around localization, and this is indeed a challenge, and I think that much can be done here. And I want to zoom in specifically on the lack of a clear approach to government involvement in protection clusters. We've seen this in Somalia and Nigeria and so forth, and the politicization that comes within a conflict situation if the government indeed is a part of the cluster, the government and the state at the same time being party to the conflict. There are also more practical but yet very important elements around localization and how we have more opportunities, missed opportunities to facilitate localization. Simple things around language, what language is being used and spoken in the cluster meetings and in the documents and so forth, and the capacity of national local actors to be able to intervene and be part of the protection cluster in country. Then on solutions and nexus, again here the challenges around, comes from the lack of clarity in itself with the protection cluster and how it maneuvers within the humanitarian coordination structures. That becomes even more of a challenge when we consider engaging with development and peace building actors and those coordination structures. So indeed a need to build much more capacity in that regard and have more guidance and clarity on that. Yeah, and then I want to finish on the regionalization. There are some great opportunities these days with UNHCR. Now we talk about protection cluster, UNHCR's regionalization process that is ongoing right now. But again, here we are looking forward to those opportunities, but also recognizing very clearly that there will be a need for very clear terms of reference for any regional coordination structures and how what is the interplay or the interface between the country, regional, global cluster or coordination structures, and making sure that the necessary resources will follow, because there will be great opportunities, but we will not be able to tap into these opportunities unless we have clarity on what this sort of regional middle level, what role it will play and how it will feed into the country, regional, global structure in terms of coordination. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Catherine. We have a follow-up question for you. So you mentioned, of course, many different kinds of actors, and Isabella, who's connecting from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is noting that in her experience, different actors are using different terms: humanitarian protection, individual protection, protection of civilians in a peacekeeping context, and is wondering if you wouldn't mind briefly elaborating on the link between these two, or perhaps clarifying briefly these concepts. So, humanitarian protection, individual protection of persons at risk, and the protection of civilians. If you wouldn't mind, Catherine, back to you.
Yeah, no, sure, and thank you for that question, because that is indeed one of the, I mean, around language and concepts and terminology, what language we use, and thereby our ability to work together and to collaborate and to coordinate. So protection of civilians is a very specific term linked to the Security Council, actually, as a fixed agenda item. So, and it also goes with, and my ICSC colleagues who would be able to speak much better to this, but that goes with international humanitarian law. So this is what we talk about in armed conflict, where international humanitarian law applies. We talk about the protection responsibilities and the protection of civilians. So that's one specific one. Then there's the concept of humanitarian protection, which I'm actually not very much in favor of. I mean, I would leave out the humanitarian, because protection is certainly not linked only to the humanitarian sphere, so to speak, exactly when we talk about the nexus and we talk about solutions that will point much further than the humanitarian programming response, but into more development-oriented and peace-building responses. So humanitarian for me is just an add-on to the term of protection. And then there was lastly the individual protection. I mean, yes, again, that's a term. I mean, when we talk about protection, this is for everyone. So whether it's an individual, whether it's a group of people or a community, a certain group of people, IDPs, refugees, and so on. I mean, this is all about protection. So you can have a specialized, I mean, a specific response, which is an individual response to individuals at risk, and then that you would call individual protection.
Great, thank you so much. It was very interesting and very helpful as well, so much appreciated there. And we'll be coming back to you. There are a couple of other questions, but I'm going to save those for the Q&A at the end. So now turning to Rebecca, up until recently, you were working as a protection advisor with the World Food Program, an agency that does not have an explicit protection mandate. You've also in the past worked with protection coordination in the field and also in the GPC. Based on your experience, how do you view the engagement of non-mandated actors in the coordination on protection, in particular in terms of challenges that you've observed when it comes to coordination? Over to you, Rebecca.
And thank you for the question. I think it's an important aspect when we're looking at a protection response in country, that we remember that we need to look beyond just the protection sector and look at what other actors bring to the table as well. Panos was mentioning the importance to keep protection central for the programmatic response, and this is exactly, I think, where it's absolutely fundamental that we make sure that we find ways of engaging actors that are not normally engaged in protection and that might find it more challenging to understand what role they play. I think over recent years, and particularly with the centrality of protection statement and the ISC protection policy, I think there's been an increase and dare I say even some enthusiasm around engaging non-mandated agencies more in the protection dialogue. I think we are beginning to see more interest also in collaborating across sectors, also at the global level between clusters than we have seen in the past. And I think these are very positive developments that we can absolutely build on. Now that said, I think we're still in a situation where there's a fairly limited understanding maybe across the board, actually, both among assistance actors, but also among protection actors, of what non-protection actors actually can bring to the table. And that is also manifested in the lack of engagement or consistent engagement of assistance actors in the protection dialogue and in coordination. Working for WFP, I've often found myself the only or one among two representatives of non-mandated agencies at various meetings on protection. And I think that is symptomatic of the lack of consistent engagement, both in terms of protection actors reaching out, but also of non-mandated agencies understanding that these are actually fora in which they should be sitting at the table and be contributing. I think this sometimes leads to a focus on what is being done wrong when the conversation is finally established and opens up. The focus is and emphasis is really what is happening that shouldn't be happening in terms of providing assistance, rather than really looking at how each of all the different actors can contribute to protection outcomes and then capitalizing on that. Not just protection actors, but obviously also non-mandated agencies. Everyone has a role to play and everyone has their mandate. But in doing so, not in doing something different than what they would normally do, but simply by implementing their mandates, they can contribute to protection, and not just in terms of mainstreaming or avoiding to add to harm that people are exposed to, but actually have positive impacts on the protection of affected people. And I think we need to harness that and better understand it to increase the impact we can have. I think one of the other things that often happens is that, and it's come up already a couple of times, this issue of language. Katrina was mentioning it. There's we are not always sure what language to use, and we don't always use the same language. And particularly when engaging with non-mandated agencies, it seems sometimes the dialogue gets a little bit lost in translation, as it were. It can be quite difficult for a logistics officer who's focused on getting his 50 metric tons of goods delivered to have a conversation with protection actors who are concerned about, are we using the right definition and how are we explaining protection and breaking it down, and then protection actors coming at that from different angles. So I think we have to do better in terms of ensuring that the language is consistent, it's simple, it's easy, it's straightforward. And then a last point, I think, is on the coordination structures themselves. Obviously, protection is a hugely complex area, and there are therefore naturally areas of responsibility and particular focus areas. And that is often replicated in the coordination structures or reflected in the coordination structures that are present on the ground. And certainly that's also the case at the global level with the various AORs together with the GPC. The problem with this becomes when non-mandated agencies have to engage, even if those agencies might be very large. Again, using WFP as the example, a very large organization. And yet on protection, the capacity is very limited. There is a focal point, and if you're lucky, a dedicated advisor, but only one person. And having to engage with multiple fora can be very, very difficult. In addition to that, it's then also important that when it gets prioritized to engage in these fora, that there is an added value, that it's seen as a place to go for advice, for support, and for collaboration. So that climate and that atmosphere has to be there as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to, so we are going to have some time to come back. So I'm going to come back to you in the Q&A, but now I'm going to turn to Claudia to ask, so you came in the beginning, but now having heard from Panos, from Catherine, from Rebecca, I wonder, how does what you've heard from them compare to your experiences in Iraq? How would you characterize the challenges for protection coordination in the context that you were describing to us previously? Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the colleagues before me, because they raised all the points that I would have raised myself. So maybe, I mean, the discussion that Catherine and the issue that Catherine was raising, they are very much on the point, as well as Rebecca and Panos and the elements that they raised as well. One element that I would add, more from a practical point of view in the context, is that Iraq, I mean, it's not an emergency context anymore. So in large operation like this one, with complex protection coordination structure as highlighted before, changing strategic direction, so from emergency responses in 2017, 2018, to a post-conflict solution orientation like this year, next year, as we articulate heavily the aspects of durable solution, exit strategy, and so on and so forth, requires a common vision, which does not necessarily materializes on the ground. So this common vision also means that all the protection coordination mechanisms, and indeed the wider ICCG community and OCHA itself, need to be brought along in the same direction. So when we talk about extreme or like sensitive protection issues vis-a-vis people with perceived affiliation, initiation of peaceful coexistence programming, and so on and so forth, what is missing and what we've been facing in Iraq is that a bit of lack of guidance on how we should move these arguments forward. So of course there is not a one size that fits all, but it would be helpful to have some operational guidance materials and or compendium of good practices on how to operationalize the transition from an emergency response to solution, both for the protection sector and also for the wider intercluster response. So we have been, for instance, reaching out to other clusters, other colleagues in Syria, in the neighboring countries, and all these exchanges have been very, very useful. But it's basically left to the field protection cluster to listen to either webinars, research good practices in other country operation, or speak to the protection cluster coordinator in the GPC community of practice, and so on and so forth. So in the Iraq case, for instance, the cluster, we have been, we did tackle one topic at the time. However, we have faced quite a lot of issues in letting also other people come together and have the buy-in that is required to move conversation forward. And the aspect that is very much linked to this is the challenge is the transition to solution also requires coordination with development actors, which can itself be a major challenge, because as we move forward and we articulate, as I said, durable solution, exit strategy, and the so-called nexus, in reality in Iraq is that humanitarians and development partners are ocean apart. When it comes, for instance, to needs assessment, if we look at the multi-cluster needs assessment or sector-specific data, we do not utilize the variety of information that is there. Or we do have separate strategic planning, HRP vis-a-vis development planning for sustainable development cooperation framework in Iraq. Or we do have not tangible interfaces that are between different coordination mechanisms. So there are issues that perhaps require a bit more guidance, and that would be one of the recommendations, for instance, for the GPC colleagues. Of course, they need to be contextualized, but they would be useful in really materializing aspects that we are all faced with, and that most of the time, or in some occasion, we don't know how to properly address. Over.
Great, thank you, Claudia. I have a follow-up question for you. This is from Julia, and it refers back actually to an issue that you mentioned earlier in the webinar regarding accountability concerns. That Julia is asking, how do you see protection mainstreaming address accountability concerns? can the adoption of a protection mainstreaming approach actually play a significant role in improving and strengthening accountability measures? Back to you.
This is a very good question. Thanks for it. Of course it can, and of course it does, because also when we discuss the aspect of protection mainstreaming that was also raised by panels, there is a bit of this, it's not an assumption, but like the fact that the protection cluster is the only actor responsible to mainstream protection, which I do not necessarily agree. I mean, it's a common responsibility that goes vis-a-vis accountability by all the actors operating in country. Of course, the protection cluster can lead the discussion and has to be part of it, but it's a joint responsibility. And of course, when there is a strong protection mainstreaming component across the board, that comes the issue of accountability. For instance, to give you an example, similar and related to this, the child protection subcluster in Iraq since early this year has basically made mandatory for partners if they want to be part of the subcluster and therefore being also considered for resource allocation calls for proposal and so on and so forth, or being, let's say, given more point and prioritized, they need to have a child safeguarding policy, which contains elements, of course, of child protection, protection mainstreaming, and so on and so forth. So the hope that is there, besides being a mandatory element to be part of the subcluster, is that there is an enhanced accountability of the partners vis-a-vis beneficiaries and vice versa. So it's a kind of check and balance system that we have to implement, and we would likely implement that can highlight and can enhance accountability of all actors operating in that particular sector.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I'm going to... Oh, yes. Sorry, I see a note from Rebecca who would like to come in. Excellent. You're on, Rebecca. Over to you.
Thank you. Just to make maybe two observations on this. I think we're already seeing difficulties in terms of mainstreaming protection across other sectors. There are huge challenges with getting this done. I was talking about some of them before. So I wouldn't rely on that approach in terms of strengthening accountability measures. I think they can maybe go hand in hand, but I think they and be mutually complementary. But I wouldn't rely on it. The other thing I just wanted to flag is that, you know, the protection cluster carries a huge role and in terms of supporting protection mainstreaming. But I think it's important also to remember that mainstreaming protection is not actually the role of the protection actors per se. The ones that are supposed to mainstream protection are the assistance actors. And I think that's very important in terms of, again, bringing them on board and making sure that they get into the picture. Now, they also have a role in making sure that they're accountable to people. So yes, in that sense, I do see that they're complementary, but it's just a word of caution in terms of not over-relying on that process to enhance accountability. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. I'd like to turn back to Catherine. We have a couple of questions that have come in, one in the chat and one in the Q&A. I'm going to put them together because they are related. So first in the chat, we had a question from Andrea in Oslo asking, what are you seeing as good practices in ensuring local leadership and protection coordination? Where is the future heading in ensuring local ownership in protection clusters? And then we had a related question from Florence asking to please expand on the challenges perceived of local actors being responsible for protection programming. So if I could turn back to you, Catherine, to address both of those questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a few points on the whole localization, as I mentioned earlier. I think there are two elements to this. I mean, localization would very much depend in terms of who we're talking about. So the first challenge I mentioned before was indeed a need, and here I see a role for GPC in terms of moving forward. So this is the recommendation in terms of getting clarity on the role of government and authorities in the countries protection clusters. So that's one part of the localization. If we talk about localization in terms of local organizations, civil society organizations, I think there are some emerging good practices out there. Also practices taking into account what we already mentioned around language and facilitating the access to the field protection clusters by making these, addressing these practical barriers. We've also seen good experiences of international organizations or more national regional organizations building capacity and supporting local organizations in engaging in clusters, protection clusters. So that's for sure a good practice and something that should be pursued. So I think, it's for all of us to look out for the opportunities for how we can build that capacity and we can build that sustainability and ownership at a local level in the protection coordination structure. There were also some good experiences around community-based protection and using the community-based protection programming as such, and those local actors that we work with in that instance, also as a way of generating, mobilizing interest for participating and facilitating participation in the local and national protection coordination structures.
Great, thanks so much, Catherine. I'd like to now turn to Panos, coming back to the mainstreaming question. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Angerd. I think on the Syria crisis, what we did is we picked up one issue where there was a sense that it was really not as well mainstreamed as it could have been, and that was the gender-based violence, GBV-AUR. We had a review that basically included an external PHAP experts who came together with the protection sector, and they sat with each sector to basically see where was it, why was it not working, what needed to be done more. And the feedback I got was quite interesting. It wasn't a lack of willingness. It was really more the practical question. What is it that, I don't know, the food security sector could do to mainstream GBV? And there were a lot of things that could be done, distribution lines, particularly in camp settings and so on, that was quite refreshing. Now, the other point I want to bring is again from a leadership point of view, and this is based on the humanitarian country team's terms of reference. We took 4 issues that we said these 4 issues are non-negotiables, and we will all adhere to implement them at the highest level in the Syria operation. And this was the leadership on protection, the GBV, accountability to affected people, and PSCA. So it was taking them all. They're all protection issues really, and accountability to affected people is really one of the major enablers, them very much linked to do equality of protection, and said how can we do it programmatically, each sector at different levels, to make them advance. So that was also important to, again, tackle these issues both from a leadership perspective and an operational, pragmatic perspective to make them effective in their implementation. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Panos. Now I'm going to turn back to Paul. So, Paul, we've heard from all of our panelists now on the challenges and weaknesses facing protection coordination. Could I ask you to tell us, in summary, what really stood out to you as the main points coming out of the discussion now?
Sure, thanks, Hagharid. I think this issue of leadership that Panos just mentioned, of course, is vital. We need protection leadership in our operations, and that needs strong support from our clusters and our global protection cluster as well. This issue of accountability worries me a bit. It's come up quite often. It seems there are still weaknesses there we must identify and work on. The issue of identifying priorities for protection has come up a couple of times as well. That shouldn't be so difficult. We should be able to somehow identify what are the major issues that we can try and deal with. The issue of one cluster approach has been mentioned a couple of times as well. This is a major challenge for us. There are many moving parts when we talk about nexus, regionalization, localization. Lack of capacity is one issue that's been mentioned there that we might need to work on from the GPC side to try and develop that. Keeping protection central has also come up a couple of times. And that other point that Daniel raised I thought was interesting and perhaps very important, that these small-scale disasters, perhaps we're not paying enough attention in those situations, and we need to focus a bit more carefully there. I won't repeat some of the good points that Claudia's made also on operationalizing and moving from emergency to stability situations, but that's also vitally important. But that's a very quick summary of some of the key issues that I've seen arising without trying to repeat what others have said. Thanks, Anne-Gareth.
And thank you, Paul. So now we'll turn to one last bit of input that we took from the survey. Put that up on the screen if we can. So we did ask participants this time around, as we did for the last two webinars, whether the GPC's role should change in the future. And interesting to note that on this question of coordination, collaboration, fewer people thought that significant change was needed compared with similar polls that we did in the previous two webinars, which were looking at the context of the nexus and then the context of climate. However, it is clear certainly that a significant portion see change needed, and I would say from the discussion so far today that there are important improvements to be made in order to strengthen coordination and protection. And I'd like to go now around the panel again to ask all of our guests what would be their recommendations to the GPC looking ahead the next 5 years in the context of these questions and challenges that have come up related to strengthening coordination for protection. So we're going to start this round by listening to the second bit of Daniel's recording, in which he includes some recommendations himself, and then we'll go around to Claudia, to Rebecca, Charles, Catherine, and then Panos. So,
thank you very much. I have just one, going back to the discussion in terms of the transition to solution, requiring coordination with development actors and other key stakeholders. So at the global level, I think that the GPC should work or should be more engaged in working to ensure that the nexus issues take a central stage in a broader humanitarian reform agenda. Engagement as well with development partners at HQ level, Geneva level. There might be discussion that at the country level are not as useful or on point as at the HQ level, to advance in particular the nexus conversation in coordination with the wider global cluster coordinator group level. And another point could certainly be develop global guidance on the operational issues mentioned earlier. I mean, when I briefly mentioned the aspect of needs assessment, separate strategic planning in between HRP or development planning, the interfaces between different coordination mechanisms and so on and so forth, it would certainly be beneficial to have more practical guidance from the GPC on this aspect in order, as I said, contextualizing them to Iraq, for instance, or to any other context, but to have a common approach to this. That is a very key issue, especially in contexts where emergencies are no longer there or they've ceased for the time being, let's say. Over.
All right, thank you, Claudia, and thanks so much for your contributions today. We've very much appreciated your inputs. Now turning to Rebecca for your recommendations to the GPC. Over to you.
Thank you. So again, coming at this from a perspective of a non-mandated agency, I think it's important that there is a strengthened focus on protection outcomes, and then from there looking at how you get to those outcomes, utilizing the full range of interventions and expertise that is at hand. And I think the analysis piece that we've already discussed a few times is really fundamental for this. The second point I would raise is the simplification of internal coordination mechanisms to have a comprehensive strategy based on the analysis that includes all the various aspects of protection and links in with an overall strategy for the entire humanitarian response on protection. So highlighting what the protection sector does, highlighting what other actors do. And a last point, in terms of bringing in more non-mandated agencies, I think it's very important that we move away from this dichotomy that seems to haunt the discussion from time to time of protection versus assistance. It's either one or the other. At the end of the day, interventions across the sectors can be fundamental for people's lives and are life-saving, and therefore they must have equal weight and equal importance. Now, if we want to make sure that whatever interventions are done outside of the protection sector, we must be practical and we must simplify how we approach this, and first and foremost avoid policing and rather looking to collaborate towards these common protection outcomes.
Right. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Very thought-provoking and very helpful contributions, and we appreciate your taking the time to join today. Now turning to Charles. From your perspective, what kind of recommendations do you think you would put to the GPC, given where they are now and what you've heard in the conversation over the last hour and a half? Over to you, Charles.
Thanks very much, Angarad. You know, representing an organization that loves coordination but is loath often to be coordinated, I don't feel in a position to give any recommendations, but let me offer the following 2 points by way of reflection. The first is to pick up on what Claudia mentioned about the nexus and the related idea of sustainable humanitarian impact. You know, the ICRC's top 10 operational countries, we've been there for over 36 years, and I think there's every indication that we're going to be there for another 36 years. And so I think that's something that we definitely need to get right. And you know, what makes an action humanitarian is not its duration or its nature, but its purpose. And I think by contrast to years gone by when conversations with donors and so forth were led out of capitals, now they have representation in country. So advancing that conversation at country level could be a very useful use of the GPC's time as well, particularly kind of linked to the urbanization of certainly parts of humanitarian and protection response. The second, I think, touches on a few points that Catherine made regarding the use, collection and use of data to inform action and prioritization. And again, it's linked to sort of the context analysis point that I made earlier. I think in a way I have no doubt that everyone does that anyway, but really going back to basics and reinforcing the soft skills, the very important skills of, you know, cultural understanding, context analysis, in order to assist with prioritization and enhance our security and acceptance. I think that certainly for the ICRC is the backbone of our responses, and I know it is for other organizations present too. Over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Charles, and thanks to you for sharing with us today. It's been really useful to have your perspective as well in the discussion, so I appreciate your taking the time. Now over to Catherine. Catherine, reflecting on the discussion again and your experience, what would be the recommendations that you would bring to the GPC for the next coming years?
Thank you very much. I'll come back to my 5 areas of challenges because they're corresponding recommendations for the GPC and its role and for the strategic framework in that regard. Regionalization is very quickly done. I already talked about, I think there are great opportunities for us. Not only UNHCR, but many of us are regionalized, so to speak, and have a regional structure. What we can do in terms of coordination, I think, is a lot, but we need to accompany that with resources, and we need to accompany that with clarity. And I think there the GPC can play a role in terms of clarifying what is the reporting line and what is the hierarchy, so to speak, between country coordination, regional and global coordination. So that's that. On the functioning of the protection clusters, I mean, coming back to my challenges, I would say, I mean, two things. There is something around the dialogue where I think GPC already does, and moving forward can play a very important role as the convener in being in regular structured dialogue with the field protection clusters, bringing them together and also facilitating that the clusters across, I mean, are engaging with one another and learning from each other. I think the GPC certainly can play a role there. I've been I mean, now we've talked a lot about all the challenges. I've been extremely encouraged recently to see several of the field protection clusters coming forward as a team. So the coordinator and the co-coordinator coming together as a team, engaging in various aspects, and that's what we would like to see. And that points to the other element of it, that we need to do something about the clarifying further the roles and responsibilities of the coordinator and the co-coordinator. And I think, I mean, it is time now. We've spent many years of exchanging MOUs and agreements in individual contexts. It must be possible, and again, I'm looking to the GPC, to build a generic MOU agreement between the co-coordinator and the coordinator, and clarifying those roles and responsibilities once and for all. And last point on the functioning is the coordination soft skills. And again, rather than we train our colleagues individually, we should, of course, bring the coordinator and the co-coordinator together and have them be trained and capacitated together in playing that role. Data analysis strategy, I think the GPC is well positioned, and in terms of where we are moving and the priorities we are discussing in the GPC, indeed are targeting, you know, building that strong collaborative, coordinated approach to data management, analysis, and strategy. So again, in terms of specific guidance and support to the field protection clusters, I think the GPC has a very important role and ability to play that role in terms of data management, analysis, and strategy. I want to finish on the solutions and nexus. And here I think there is indeed a need for all of us to get a better understanding of what this means. And in this case, we, the GPC, needs to help out the field protection clusters in terms of mapping where and how do they navigate in the nexus, what is meaningful, who are the partners that the protection clusters need to engage with, and what sort of collaboration would be meaningful and constructive for them. I just want to mention two elements here as well. The opportunity to engage much more, and that also points to localization, with human rights institutions, the ombudsman, local national human rights institutions and actors. I think they are the ones that one set of actors that can help us transcend the divide, so to speak, from the humanitarian sphere into the development and peace building sphere, and that in that respect also help out the protection cluster. So I think that is a set of actors to look out for and to move forward with. The last point I want to make is around mixed situations, and again, this at times a very rigid coordination structure where you have the IDP situation and then you have other coordination structures for other groups of people. And we've seen this in North Africa, for example. Now we're moving forward in a good direction, but I'm really urging again the GPC also to be supportive here and facilitate the work of the clusters and the protection coordination structures, in a sense of not being too rigid, because of course everything is linked. So while you work with one group, I mean, what happens to them also impacts on another group. So we need to broaden out our spectrum and support our field protection coordination structures in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, and really thank you so much for the work, the thought that you clearly put into all of the observations and the recommendations, really packing in a lot of important points to think about, to work on, and to take forward. Very much appreciate your inputs. I'd like to turn now, last but not least, to Panos. Panos, what recommendations do you have in mind now following our discussion when you think about the GPC for the next 5 years?
Thank you. Thanks, Howard. A lot has been said already. For me, it's really the GPC to need, first of all, to further strengthen the field support, to how to have possibly teams go out, how to really go every year to say we're going to target the top 10, 15 operations, and to see it's not a lack of policy. Policy-wise, there's lots of it. It's how to apply it, how to implement it in very complex situations where I've seen again and again colleagues struggling to say how do we make it happen, both in terms of the strategy, the mainstreaming, but also better engagement with the leadership in this operation to really explain that leadership role, to demystify that taboo word, protection, and how really to make it practical and operation on the ground. So the field support is one. The second one is that protection monitoring, and I feel, to be honest, that lots of the sectors have advanced significantly in terms of packaging, presenting, highlighting. I don't know whether it's because of sensitivities or what it is, but I find on the protection monitoring, which is really crucial, it doesn't happen as much as we would like it to see, and to be able to present what the issues are and how to focus in terms of the gaps and what needs to be done, or what has been done and where we're moving further. My third recommendation is, to be honest, I would like to see the Global Protection Center a lot more central in the coordination, working really hand in hand with OCHA when the HNO, when the HRP, when all these assessments are taking place. Protections cluster should not be yet another cluster. It's not the same like if we talk about any other. It's not like food and health and so on. It's a cross-cutting cluster that cuts across everything, and therefore needs to be a lot more in the central part, including to getting the OCHA colleagues to have a better understanding of the issues and how to make sure that these protection concerns are really put central on the assessments, on the response, on the monitoring, on the funding, on everything we do. I feel that there is a big gap, to be honest, and there is a lot of space to improve that closeness practically, operationally at the field level. Thank you, and really well done to PHAP for having another fantastic discussion on a topic that affects all of us in the operations. Over to you.
And thank you, Panos. Again, very happy you were able to take the time to join us today and to share really important reflections that I know will be taken into account now. So thanks again for that. And now to turn back again to Paul. I wonder, Paul, if you have any remarks, some final remarks from your side, again, reflecting now as well on the recommendations that we've heard coming out of today's discussion. Back to you, Paul.
Well, thanks, colleagues, for a fantastically fruitful discussion over the last 90 minutes. I guess one thing for me that I think is this discussion sometimes about a bottom-up approach. I think that can actually help solve a lot of our problems about localization, about where regionalization sits, about setting priorities. So I think that's something we can give consideration to as we're drafting our strategy also. How do we make our top-down and bottom-up approach link a little better together? So I think that's just my final reflection, and but really a very great thank you to PHAP and all the colleagues for joining today.
All right, thank you, Paul, and great once again to be co-hosting with you. So now wrapping things up, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved today, very much Paul, also all of our guest panelists, to all of the participants who were very active today with some great questions. We didn't manage to get to all of them, so we will be following up with the questions we didn't get to address on the air. I'd also like to thank, of course, the team behind the scenes here at PHAP making this possible, as well as colleagues in the GPC for the important brainstorming and collaboration beforehand. The recording of today's events, both in a video format and in an audio-only podcast format, will be available on the event page in the coming days. You'll get a notice about that in the follow-up email. We'll also be posting the complete survey results once those are done, and on that note, if you haven't yet had a chance to complete the survey, you do have a final opportunity today. If you complete it before tomorrow, we will be able to include your input as well in the final report. So if you haven't done so, please do take a moment to complete the survey. The link is there on the screen so that we can include your inputs as well in the event report. So with that, once again, thank you to everyone for a very interesting discussion, and we look forward to a next opportunity to see all of you online. With that, I'm Herod Lang signing off from Geneva. Thank you. Bye-bye.